Hello everyone, and in this video I will walk you through static pods. Introduction to static pods in Kubernetes. Static pods are managed directly by the kubelet daemon on a specific node without API server observation. So this is an important point. They are managed directly by the kubelet daemon on the worker node, and they are not observed directly by the API server. They are bound to a specific kubelet on a node, and they are not part of a control plane node, means they are not observed by the control plane. Static pods differ from pods managed by the control plane. For example, like a deployment, the kubelet monitors each static pod and restart if it fails. So it is isolated, or it's disconnected from the control plane master nodes restart mechanism. For example, deployment, if you it's directly observed and controlled by the control plane, but in this static pod, the kubelet component, which is a client, which is a worker node component, that one directly monitors this static pod and restart if there is any failure. The kubelet tries to create a mirror pod on the Kubernetes API server for each static pod. This makes pods visible on the API server, but they can't be controlled from there. So this is just something extra. Like kubelet, they create a mirror pod, but only for observer, like not only for to provide a view, so that it's visible on the API server. But you basically cannot do anything. You cannot control it or shut it down or change image or anything. So you have to directly log into worker node and make changes. So we have the node and we have the kubelet daemon, and which manages all this static pod, and they are not observed directly by the API server, which is on the control plane. And control plane, for example, deployment does not manage. So deployment cannot manage a static pod. Static pod are created statically on the worker node, and kubelet, which is on the worker node, monitors and restart if there is any failure of static pod. The important point is that's why we call it static pod. We don't call it static deployment or static result stateful set or static daemon set. So this is just a pod. So even the YAML will be having pod configuration only. So you have kubelet, which manages static pod, and it will create a mirror pod so that you can just view it, but you cannot control it. Okay, limitations and prerequisites for static pods. Static pods cannot refer to other API objects like service account, config map, secrets, etc. So they cannot refer or talk or communicate with them. They do not support ephemeral containers. In clustered Kubernetes, static pods may be less preferable to a daemon set. So in a clustered Kubernetes, it's better to go with daemon set, because that also runs on all worker node. So that's why static pods are less preferable. Okay, to use static pods, basically you need you can use kubectl command line tool to communicate with the cluster, and at least two nodes. So you can just create a static pod on a control plane, a worker node, not on the control plane. So I'll show you one example next. So static pod. So this is the limitation. Static pod cannot have a service account, config map, secret, and ephemeral containers. In a normal pod, we can refer to a secret, config map, all this, because these are managed by the API server. So but because static pod cannot talk with the API server, so that's why we cannot have all these four components, and it's less preferred from daemon set, because daemon set is also observed, and it can run one pod on each node. So that's why it has more feature set than static pod. Okay, creating a static pod. Static pods can be configured with a file system hosted configuration file. Manifests a standard pod definition in a specific directory. So it must reside in a specific directory, which is scanned by the kubelet. An example which I will show you is like a simple web server static pod, which I will create on a worker one node. Alternatively, static pods can be configured with a web hosted configuration file. The kubelet periodically downloads the file containing pod definition and applies changes if any. So this is a bit extra information, like it can be a web hosted also, and kubelet will basically periodically pull this file and download and create. If there is any changes, it will apply the changes as well. So this is how it looks like. So you can SSH into worker 1 and then just run you can keep this file. So I'm just creating in one shot through so this for example, in this case by default it scans for etc Kubernetes manifest file, and you have kube API server.yaml file also in this location. So you can just create a YAML with the pod manifest. So if you just create a file or place a file over there, it will be running as a static pod, and kubelet on this worker node will look for this file and create this particular pod, and it runs only on this pod. And then you can just restart the kubelet component. Okay, observing static pod behavior. When the kubelet starts, it automatically begins all defined static pods. Automatically starts all defined static pods. Running containers including static pods can be viewed using, for example, if you are running container D, you can use crickctl ps command. If you have docker container, then you can just use docker ps and you can see the static pod and the container which is part of that pod. Okay, mirror pods on the API server can be viewed using kubectl get pods command, and if an attempt is made to delete the mirror pod from the API server using the kubectl, the kubelet does not remove the static pod. So you run, but it will have no effect if you try to delete the mirror pod also from the API server. So you have kubelet which starts the static pod, and static pod becomes a running container and can be viewed by, for example, if we have container D, crick crickctl ps command. So Kubernetes API server can view the mirror pod and there is no action, and if there is a deletion attempt, there is no action, and you can, but it's possible to use kubectl get pod commands to see the mirror pod. Okay, dynamic addition and removal of static pods. The running kubelet periodically scans the configured directory for changes and adding and removing pods as files appear. So it's completely based on file. It will pick up any file changes, any updates, new pod files appear, disappear in that directory. So which we have seen, etc Kubernetes manifest, and this dynamic adjustment is shown through moving the static web.yaml file. So if that file which I created in the, if you just remove it or move it, that pod will be gone, but if you put it back, the pod will be recreated. And that's all. Thanks for watching.